Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest Babel webinar. My name is Simon Coughlin. I'm an Associate Director here at Babel. For those that don't know, Babel is a B2B tech PR agency. We're based in London, but we've got clients across the world working in multiple different sectors, including cybersecurity. And I'm pleased to see that we've got a number of those clients with us on the line today. So thanks very much all for joining us. We were going to allow some time at the end of the discussion for questions, but do feel free to ask any questions for Nicole or Ciaran throughout the course of the discussion using the chat functionality. I'm going to move now to welcome today's panelists. First of all, we have Nicole Perlroth. Nicole's a cybersecurity reporter at the New York Times, where she's been for more than 6 years. In 2019, President Trump called her out for treason after she wrote an article on how America was stepping up digital incursions into Russia's electric power grid in a warning to President Putin. Nicole is also a guest lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and she lives in California. For her new book, which I'm going to show you now. And I know both Ciaran and I have got a copy of the book, which we are reading. There it is. Her new book is called "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends." Over the course of 7 years, Nicole interviewed more than 300 people linked to the underground cyber arms industry. And if you haven't got a copy of the book, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a riveting read. As well as Nicole, we are joined by Professor Ciaran Martin CB. Ciaran is a Professor of Practice at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. For 6.5 years, ending in the middle of 2020, Ciaran led the UK government's work in cybersecurity. The UK NCSC is now recognised as one of the leading public authorities in the world for cybersecurity. Its approach has been lauded around the world, and Ciaran has been honoured for his groundbreaking efforts to combat cyber threats. Okay, we're going to move on to the questions now. This week, Thursday, the 11th of March, marks 1 year since the World Health Organization declared the outbreak of COVID-19 a pandemic. Clearly, it's a global disease which has impacted every aspect of our lives, both professionally and personally. I'm guessing that for most of you, you're dialing in from home. So yeah, it's really changed every aspect of our lives, but certainly from a cybersecurity aspect, it's had a huge impact on the way that organizations treat threats and the type of threats that they are seeing on a daily basis. So I'm going to pass over to Nicole. In your view, how has the cybersecurity threat landscape been impacted as a direct result of the pandemic?
Well, I think we virtualized our ways at a scope and a speed that we had never done before. And speed, I think most cybersecurity experts would agree, is the natural enemy of security. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a huge jump in targeting from work from home tools and remote protocols. And we saw a big jump in ransomware. But the main thing was all of these organizations were trying to enable employees to work from home from their personal devices, and they didn't have the same intrusion detection systems, the same security wrapped around employees' personal devices. So it just became a very lucrative ripe target for cybercrime. Oops, sorry. So we saw sort of a flood of targeting towards these work from home tools. But the big thing, I think, was, at the very beginning of the pandemic, we had this very telling warning sign, which was an attack that Israel reported on its water treatment facilities. This was just as Israelis were staying home in the pandemic, I believe last April. and they reported an attack on their water treatment facility. And it was unclear whether it was to stop the flow of water to people's homes as they were shuttered at home, or whether it was an effort to contaminate the water. But that was last April. And then fast forward just to a couple of weeks ago, we had the same kind of attack here in the United States. And there's no sign that either of those were connected in any way. But those are the attacks that I think will go down as having bookended this tremendous year in our lives, where we saw the threat landscape really change dramatically. We saw, like I said, a huge uptick in ransomware. A lot of ransomware groups started heading for big game targets, companies that might not have tip-top security because they were moving their employees to these remote tools. We also saw, at first we were really worried here in the United States about the election and ransomware threats to the election. And so there was a major takedown of TrickBot, the group that gives access or sells access to ransomware groups. So after that takedown, we saw a huge resurgence in ransomware attacks on hospitals here in the United States. Unclear if that was revenge for some of those takedowns, but that was a big one. And we're still seeing ransomware attacks on hospitals here. So I think it's just sort of more of the same, but from my perspective, it became really hard to keep track also of all the nation states that were targeting each other's vaccine and treatments and preparedness plan responses. We saw countries that we usually don't cover because we usually don't detect their cyber attacks, start probing other countries' vaccine research efforts. And I think the root cause for that was that this was a global pandemic, but the response to it has been anything but. Each country has had to come up with their own response, their own treatments. And so I think each country was using cyber as a means to get an early glimpse of what each of these other countries were up to in terms of their response and their vaccine preparations. And so for my quarantined perch here, it just became really impossible to keep track of all the APTs, all the nation state efforts. And so just in general, I think, this period will go down, at least in my own memory, as a period where we saw, sort of every threat under the sun emerge just with a speed and a scope that we had never seen before. And I think, given that not all companies plan on returning to the office, and I think there's going to continue to be a lot of virtualization moving forward, and we're only digitizing our lives more, and the rush to the Internet of Things, but also artificial intelligence. I think this could be an early glimpse of what the future threat landscape looks like. So I'm hoping we can take this time to really do the analysis on what we're seeing, where it's coming from, who's getting targeted, what vulnerabilities are getting exploited, and use it as a learning exercise for the future. Because, if we don't, then, that's just going to be an early glimpse of what could come.
Thanks, Nicole. And Ciaran, moving over to you, what's your view on how the pandemic has impacted the threat landscape? Certainly from the clients that we deal with here at Babel. I was speaking with one client the other day that they didn't really see the huge impact that you would perhaps expect from a global pandemic. Certainly there was an uptick in pandemic-related incidents perhaps in March, April last year, but after that it tailed off. What have you seen here in the UK?
Hi, well, first, thanks for having me, and congratulations to Nicole on the book. I'm not often on webinars with New York Times best-selling authors, or indeed, I'm not sure I ever am, but just to echo your recommendation of it, it's a really interesting and original insight into an unexplored part of the cybersecurity landscape. Funnily enough, it'd be surprising if I said a great deal differently to Nicole, given she's covering cybersecurity for a major global newspaper, and I, at the start of the pandemic, was running it for upper medium-sized nation state that's closely allied with the US. So if we were saying things that were remarkably different from each other on the threat landscape, something was probably in this on one side or other. So I'll just try and give a little bit of different flavour. Firstly, the point Nicole made about this massive experiment, sudden unplanned experiment in home working. I mean, in a sense, I'm trying to be upbeat because there's so much pessimism around at the moment, understandably. It didn't go nearly as badly as I would have thought it done. So if you'd said, because I preached risk management as the key to most cybersecurity for a very long time in the UK government, if you said to me, right, most organisations of any size, all over the economy, big, small, with strong security cultures, with weak security cultures, they're all going to move to large-scale home working in a week with no prior planning. I said, oh my, this is going to be an absolute catastrophe. And in a sense, maybe a bit of government help, a bit of sensible planning, a bit of sort of goodwill, and everybody realizing that things had to be different if they're going to work. And perhaps because I think, don't forget as well, because it was a pandemic, attackers were affected too. There have been articles in the US and the UK about national security institutions having to go to part, staffing and so forth. The same would have happened to attackers. So, everybody was affected by it. And in a sense, the wonderful thing is that there wasn't more harm because technology kind of sustained us during that period. It would have been even worse during that period if we couldn't have worked from home, if we couldn't have kept in touch with friends and loved ones all over the place. So, in a sense, I think given that public confidence in technology is now so important, it's worth noting what didn't happen as well as what did happen. So then just a few reflections with some nuance and augmentations of what Nicole said. The cybercrime picture, I think firstly, as you said, Simon, all of a sudden, instead of tax refunds and fake driving infraction penalties, it was all about COVID. It was either about selling fake kit or PPE or tests, or it was about fake government schemes. So it just shows you how cybercrime follows fear and exploits fear and pretend authority. Secondly, there was some uptick in general cybercrime, but there was some downtick as well for reasons I said. We were tracking some big cybercrime groups who worked out of warehouses that they could no longer go to because they were locked down as well. But I think to endorse a point Nicole made, the one big exception was ransomware went pretty much out of control in a very dangerous way. Now, whether that would have happened anyway, I'm not sure, because I recall my former opposite number in the US, Chris Krebs, who has something in common with Nicole in that they've both been called all sorts of names by President Trump. He and I, as he has said, sat in the Munich Security Conference in February 2020 before it was clear how bad the pandemic was going to be, talking about how ransomware was getting out of control. He'd had this big deal in the city of New Orleans. We were having difficulties in the UK local authorities. So ransomware we were losing the battle on ransomware already, but I think with the pandemic it became more serious. And we're still not got on top of it. The final point I would make is nation state activity. Nicole described it accurately about what they were up to and how hard it was to keep track. I think the lesson for defenders and for us as sort of Western free societies was you've got to be pretty flexible and nimble and agile about what you're defending. So Nicole already mentioned water, and water and that hard infrastructure has been a focus, but all of a sudden the healthcare system, it was always important, but it was never quite as important as it was as it became last year. And then when I was making the transition from government to the University of Oxford, these tiny little research institutes in Oxford that were not set up to defend against nation-state cyber attacks were suddenly the center of the world, if you like, because of so much of the important vaccine research going on there. And so you had to national authorities and civic society had to just recalculate what was important, because some things that weren't important in 2019 were fundamentally important in 2020. It did change the risk calculations. Cybersecurity is still all about risk, and some of the risk calculations changed.
Ciaran, just looking back at ransomware, you mentioned there that we are struggling to get on top of this big issue. We've seen an increased number of attacks on organisations in the UK and globally over the past few months. What more can organisations do, firstly, to prevent those types of incidents? And secondly, when they do become victims, what's your advice for how they should respond?
Well, my advice controversially as always don't pay. I would say that, wouldn't I? I do realize the invidious position organizations are in, and I include, public authorities that have, child protection responsibilities and things are in a dreadful position. But to get slightly, not that technical, but to get slightly technical, ransomware is changing, and this is important. So, cybersecurity for the uninitiated is essentially about confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And original ransomware was just about availability. They locked you out and you couldn't use it. The problem from the attacker's point of view of that is that it's actually reasonably easy to defend against, because all you need is backups that you can access in due course, and you suffer a bit of damage, but you can get it back. So if all you're worried about is availability, then if you've backed up, then why would you pay a ransom for something you've basically got a spare copy of? Because of that, they're now moving towards, some of the ransomware gangs are moving towards leaking data. So you've got the backups, you're still going, so they're now leaking your data to embarrass you. Now that's a different problem. And I think it's easier to stay strong and hold the line there. It's not as if you're, if you don't have a backup, I'm afraid, I would say it's an almost morally unacceptable place to be in these days. If you're running something important and you don't have a backup and somebody can actually extort money out of you and you're going to pay it, that's not really defensible. If you do have decent backups and then you're getting embarrassed and so forth because of data leakages, I do think that is a different calculation. I would encourage people not to pay, and certainly to talk to the authorities and so on. But I think so that's what organizations can do, just do it better. There's a bigger whole of society and government sort of issue here, in that the business model is wrong, the incentives are wrong. It's pretty easy to insure against it. We've got bizarre laws in this country, which is that if it's a terrorist group, you can't pay the ransom, but if it's not, you can. Which I know why that's the case, because it all dates from kidnappings and 15 years ago. There are extortion laws and so forth. But I think we need to look at the incentive structure to make sure to change the calculation, because what you don't want to be doing is leaving what's essentially a matter of public policy and sort of social norms. You don't want to be leaving that to a bunch of individual organizations to make on their own in situations of crises.
Mm-hmm.
And Nicole, how are you seeing ransomware attacks develop, and what's the situation with insurance payments in the US?
Yeah, it's such a good point. The incentive structures in cybersecurity in general are all backwards. Just to echo Ciaran's point, it's so interesting. I wrote the book because the incentive structures I thought were so backwards. Just backing up a bit, from an individual level, our incentive is to get access to as many things as possible, as quickly as possible, and as conveniently as possible. And again, that is the natural enemy of security. Businesses, their incentive is to get product to market as quickly as possible, to beat out the competition, and to deal with the security problems later, or maybe establish a moat around their organization after the fact, with firewalls, et cetera. And that has not worked. So, and then government's incentive is a little bit misaligned in that they want to be able to conduct espionage and battlefield preparations. And sometimes that involves vulnerabilities in software that they necessarily need to exploit to do this program. So I'm fascinated by these incentive structures, but never is it more clear than with ransomware, because the ransom demands are always, no matter how pricey they are. So, we are talking about a huge jump from something like $300 in, holding a individual PC owner with ransomware maybe 7 years ago, to now $10 million for a giant healthcare company. And companies are paying because the cost to remediate, to build back all that data from scratch, to basically build all new systems, because they can't be confident that everything that they have isn't, infected still with backdoors or whatnot. Their insurers are essentially telling them, go ahead and pay this, because it will still be cheaper than the total cost of wiping your systems clean and starting from scratch. So the incentives there are hugely misaligned. And the problem is that the payments and demands keep going up, up, up. So at what point does this stop? And I think this is going to be the year that we have some hard conversations in government around, should we make it illegal for ransomware victims to pay? Because we are just funding this gigantic criminal enterprise, essentially. And, like I said, the payments just keep going up, and, more and more companies are getting cyber insurance, and these insurers are paying. So it's been a huge problem here in the United States, not just with hospitals, but schools. In Baltimore, just as students were resorting to remote learning, their school administrative systems were held up with ransomware. So students, elementary school students couldn't do Zoom learning. Cities, towns, even before, right before the election, like I said, we were really worried about ransomware affecting the ability to check in voters or verify their information or their voter registration status. And we didn't see a lot of ransomware ultimately day of, but there were some towns and counties that experienced ransomware attacks that made it difficult for them to do things like verify voter signatures against their mailed-in ballots, because we did a lot more mail-in voting this year. So it wasn't as bad, I think, actually, as some feared, but it was really bad in certain sectors, and the cost of these attacks just grew astronomically.
Turning now to the perpetrators and how we fight back against these attackers. I know Ciaran recently reported suggesting that the state should launch military cyber attacks to shut down these ransomware gangs. Could you just provide a bit of outline as to your reason for that belief? Well,
nothing gets lost in the telling, and I think, again, as I remember for the second time mentioning my former US counterpart Chris Krebs, who gave an interview to the Financial Times where it was the same sort of thing. I mean, nobody's, well, neither of us are saying that there should be military strikes against, against criminals without due process. It's a little bit more boring than that, but I will try to explain. I mean, essentially, I'll come to states in a minute, but when you take cyber criminals, there are a few things. So let's do ransomware and then general cybercrime. So in ransomware, there are basically three things you can do. You can improve defenses. We've talked about that, backups and so forth. You can change the incentive structure, and Nicole's just dealt with that, so I won't repeat it. And then when both of those, as and when both of those fail, there are technical options sometimes if you've got good intelligence, and you can do controlled operations and what this means is, and Nicole's already mentioned things like trickbot botnets and so forth, you can take technical disruptive measures that basically stop stuff from working, and therefore it can't be used to attack you. Now, there are all sorts of challenges around this. What it reflects, though, I think is a real problem in international cybercrime, not just ransomware, which is that, law enforcement people will often rightly say to you, well, you cyber types, crime is crime, and, there's nothing that new in cybercrime, it's just a different way. And to a large extent, that's often true. Where it isn't true is that for the first time in human history, it is possible to inflict large-scale consistent damage on a society without ever setting foot in it or the territory of its allies. So, if you take, say, terrorism, you can plot from abroad, you can conspire, you can raise funds, you can money launder and so forth, but ultimately you or somebody working with you has to set foot on the territory of the organization you're trying to harm. And even if they're plotting in our case in Europe or North America, you've got arrangements and so forth. With transnational cybercrime, none of that can apply. So you can have groups operating out of Russia. It is unconstitutional, even if relations were better with Russia than they currently are, it is unconstitutional for Russia to extradite Russians. So you can present Russia with all the evidence you want, and until it changes its constitution, you're never going to disrupt it through law enforcement. So, so then these people use infrastructure. Can you basically do a takedown of that infrastructure? And to do that, you need really good intelligence, because it doesn't say, hello, I'm a international criminal ransomware apparatus. you need to know that you can control it, because some of these techniques and weapons that Nicole's explored in her book are called viruses for a reason. They will jump onto other things, and you can end up, a Russian state attack on a Ukrainian professional services firm in 2017 ended up disrupting production at a chocolate factory in Tasmania, which I think we can be pretty sure was not the primary target. So there are all sorts of reasons why so it is a last resort. And for my money, although others disagree, and it's a live debate in the West, particularly the US at the minute, following major state-sponsored intrusions, for my money, it tends to be deployable principally against non-state actors. It doesn't tend to work as a response to state attacks, just because it's so escalatory, because actually the state, you're not going to attack civilians through it, and the stuff that you might do is that you might attack is better protected. So, that is a very long-winded way of saying the details matter. I'm not calling for armies to go and kill criminals in other countries, because that breaks so many laws I don't have time to explain them and is so unethical. But there are technical things you can do in a largely ungoverned space. Again, Nicole's book explores a major part of this really well, to try and disrupt the most aggressive and persistent of these criminals.
And Nicole, over to you. What was your view on taking this type of direct action?
Well, listen, I think that part of the problem with the cyber threat landscape is there hasn't been sufficient penalties for some of this activity. Just as Ciaran mentioned, we have not been able to punish Russian cyber criminals because Russia doesn't extradite its cyber criminals. So we have to wait till they go on vacation in the Maldives, and then we might be able to pick them up there. Here in the US, we've been doing, a pretty sustained naming and shaming campaign of North Korean cyber criminals, Iranian state-backed hackers, Chinese military soldiers who were responsible for thousands of attacks on US intellectual property. And there's really no chance that we'll ever have those people in prison just because of extradition prohibition. So anyway, there has not been enough penalties. And, with ransomware, the costs just keep going up for these ransom demands. It's becoming almost $1 billion enterprise. So what do you do? And I think this year, in the great experiment, as Ciaran called it, we've seen some attempts to impose penalties. Just ahead of the election, Cyber Command here in the United States hacked into the TrickBot command and control infrastructure and sent these computers that would have otherwise been used to deploy ransomware into a feedback loop where they were just dialing themselves over and over again so they couldn't be reached. It didn't last long. We did it twice. It didn't last long, but it was enough to send a message to cyber criminals and anyone that would use that infrastructure to, for instance, interfere in our elections, that we had their number and that we could take down their systems if need be. And you've seen, so I don't think of it even as a military strike. I think of it more as messaging. And you see more of that messaging, when during the 2018 midterm elections here in the United States, we know Cyber Command hacked into the computers of the Internet Research Agency in Russia, the same trolls that really took aim at the 2016 election, and they had been seeding a lot of disinformation and divisive content on Twitter and social media to send a message. And we literally posted a message to their computers saying, we know who you are. Essentially, I don't know what the exact quote was, but it said something like, we know who you are. We know where you live. We know where you work. And if you do something to these elections, we will find you, essentially. But this was all messaging. So messaging, I think, is a great tool. I really do. Where it gets kind of dicey is when you start to enshrine critical infrastructure like the power grid as a legitimate target for nation states and for a deterrent strategy. And that is one thing that we have been engaged in here in the United States. That's why former President Trump called me out for treason, was because my colleague David Singer and I broke the story that that the United States, in retaliation for Russia's own attacks on our grid, but also in part for the 2016 election interference, was hacking into the Russian grid and doing it in an uncharacteristically noisy way, to basically say, listen, we're in your grid too, and should you do something here, we can turn around and do the same thing to you. And in a way, it was more messaging. When we went to the National Security Council just ahead of publishing that story and said, here's what we have, do you want to comment, or should we have one of these painful conversations that journalists and government usually have with these sensitive stories, they said, no, we're fine with you publishing, go ahead and publish, we have no problems at all with the story appearing in the front pages of the New York Times. And that was because it was more messaging. So messaging, I think at this point is good, but it does beg the question of, where does this stop? At what point does this escalation stop? And that's when you get into these conversations about, should we have international digital norms of behavior, or what Brad Smith at Microsoft has called a digital Geneva Convention, where we essentially agree not to hack one another's critical infrastructure, not to hack hospitals or the power grid or elections. And I think the problem with that is, that makes perfect sense. Who would in their right mind say that's a bad idea, right? That seems to make a lot of sense. The problem is when you get into the details, which, we, the United States and the UK and our Five Eyes partners are at a little bit of a disadvantage here, in that most of our cyber operations, if not all of them, come out of government. Here in the United States, it comes from Cyber Command. NSA does a lot of our espionage operations, as do other intelligence agencies. In China, it's different. A lot of their operations still do come out of the PLA, but more often the most sophisticated attacks we see coming from China come from the Ministry of State Security, and not even really the Ministry of State Security themselves, but the satellite network of contractors that they tap for some of their most sensitive attacks. So they maintain a degree of plausible deniability that we don't have here. Same thing in Russia. They have a very healthy or unhealthy, toxic maybe, relationship with their cyber criminals. When we indicted the people responsible for the Yahoo breach a few years ago, it came down to 4 people. Half of them were Russian cyber criminals, and the other half were Russian intelligence agents who said, go ahead and profit from this, but if you find an email account that belongs to a staffer at the White House, pass it on to us, and there will be no repercussions for you. And so that is sort of the way it works in Russia. They have plausible deniability. Same thing in Iran. We just had a set of indictments, and it turned out a lot of the people conducting some of the most high-profile attacks out of Iran weren't coming from the IRGC headquarters. They were coming from these front companies that basically worked on behalf of the IRGC. So, all of these countries have this degree of plausible deniability that we don't have in the UK or in the US. So if we, the UK, US, were to agree to a set of norms with our adversaries that said, hey, we'll agree not to hack your power grid or your hospitals, that's fine. But more likely than not, if there were an attack to come at our hospitals or our power grid from some of these other countries, it would likely come from these outside groups. And, Putin could say just what he said the other year, which was, hackers are like artists. They just get up in the morning and start painting. So, it gets really tricky in the fine print. And so I don't think that we are going to see the United States, at least anytime soon, agree not to hack critical infrastructure, because we are such a target. And we've clearly enshrined our own attacks on critical infrastructure as a deterrent strategy, as a counter-proliferation strategy, I guess, in the case of Stuxnet. So, we're getting to this very precarious place of, it's as if we're waiting for the right geopolitical trigger point for someone to actually pull the trigger on the access that they already have into these systems. And that is obviously very problematic. But, you don't know what you don't know. And as a journalist, you don't know a lot. You're always fumbling around in the dark. And one of the things I would love to know and I doubt I'll ever find out, is did the US attacks on the Russian grid in the years going into the 2020 election, was that a deterrent? Did Russia not do more to attack or interfere in our elections because the US was in its critical infrastructure? Is that why they pivoted to an attack on SolarWinds and federal IT networks that would be considered more classic espionage that might not, traverse the red line, because we do those attacks all the time? And I think that is a really interesting question: is did it ultimately serve as a deterrent for further election interference? And so the only way you would know that is if you're a fly sitting on the wall in the Kremlin. So, one thing that hopefully in 25 years we'll learn in someone else's book.
Thanks, Nicole. You mentioned China there, and I briefly wanted to touch on a story which has been developing over the past week. It's still in the press today, and this is the hack on Microsoft's Exchange email software that Microsoft itself is blaming on China. And I know, Nicole, you were reporting this at the weekend. It's a developing story. The Financial Times this morning have said it's developing what was thought to be quite a targeted attack is now impacting what they call tens of thousands of businesses and public sector victims. Nicole, what background do you have on this particular incident?
Well, we know that Velexity, which is an American cybersecurity firm, discovered, I believe it was 40 days in Microsoft Exchange server software, and that this was getting quietly exploited by China. We know that Microsoft issued this emergency patch last week ahead of its usual schedule, because they did see these flaws getting exploited in the wild by China. And so they issued the patch, and unfortunately the patch is a little bit complicated to implement. It's not an easy, click and get it done. So as soon as they issued the patch, we just saw this rampant, really aggressive effort, not just by the Chinese group who had exploited these flaws in the first place, but by several Chinese state-backed actors, we believe, exploiting these systems to get as much data as they possibly could before these systems got patched. And so why is this a problem? Well, the speed at which all of these systems were suddenly getting hacked was unlike anything we had seen this year. So that's, telling, given that I was just talking about how this year has been a real blossoming period for cyber threats and cybercrime. So just the speed of it was really notable. The targets were still not quite clear. We were told originally that this was an attack on the defense industrial base, but when you looked at who was getting exploited last week after the patch rolled out, it was sort of everyone. It was a lot of state and local governments, schools, police departments. So, I still am a little bit foggy on the victimology here in terms of what the original target was and then where it moved. But, the timing of it was really a complex factor here in the United States, because part of the story that we reported on yesterday was that the US is really struggling, or not struggling, but they're planning on responding to the SolarWinds attack in the next few weeks. And we had heard that there was going to be a cyber element to the response, one that would not be apparent to the wider public, but they felt compelled to respond to this with some sort of cyber element. So I don't know what exactly it will be, but all of a sudden, as they're planning this other thing happens from China, and suddenly it begs the question, well, if you're going to respond to this attack from who we believe is Russia, don't you also have to respond to this Chinese attack? And if you're going to, announce that you're going to add some cyber element to the Russian response, are you going to add a cyber element to the response to the Chinese attacks? And it just gets back to this question of, where does this all lead us? Where is this all going, and where does it end? And it just shows that it's really hard to respond in kind to cyber, especially, in the SolarWinds case. That's an attack that lots of governments do, supply chain software attacks for espionage. So really hard discussions happening right now in the administration here.
And Ciaran, in terms of the looking back to your time at the NCSC, when these types of attacks happen, what sort of advice were you giving to organizations? I know there was some guidance yesterday from CISA in the US that all organizations across all sectors should address this vulnerability. But from an organizational standpoint, where do they turn for their advice when this type of things happen?
It depends where you are. I hope that in the last few years in the UK, we did some good at the NCSC in getting fairly rapid and reasonably usable stuff up there. So I think probably the worst incident in my time in charge was the May 2017 so-called WannaCry attack, which turned out to be an accidental launch. Well, it wasn't accidental launching it, but it was not intended to. An ransomware attack on Asian institutions was not intended to disrupt hospital bookings in England and Scotland, and what's more, in the middle of a general election campaign. So it was a pretty stressful. Event, and within 24 hours we had something. I mean, I think the reason I'm highlighting that is there were 3 pieces of guidance. So one was for every citizen, because we didn't quite know how far this was going to go out of control, and was it going to go into ordinary devices that people were using individually, was it going to go into small businesses and so forth. A second was for organizational leaders. You're not technical, but this is what the sort of thing you should be looking at in terms of your own business and organization. And the third was for technical, head chief security officers and people like that. This is actually what you need to, this is the code you need to write, this is the patch you need to download, because Microsoft mercifully had agreed to develop a new patch for unsupported software. So that's the sort of thing you should be doing. And I mean, there's all sorts of advice flying around the US, which I'm not going to reprise now, about what you should do depending on what's been done to you and so forth. That's quite technical. But the main thing is pay attention, and the scale of this compromise that Nicole has been describing is huge, and very difficult actually to get your arms around quite how big it is. So that's that's the first thing. I think then there is a set of issues around 2 other things. So that's the thing for organizations. In terms of what Nicole's just been saying, there's a thing about government, and there's a thing about for the tech ecosystem as a whole, in terms of these 2 major campaigns against the United States and the lessons of that. I mean, I would agree with her that the prospects of a digital Geneva Convention are pretty remote. For 2 reasons. One, which is pretty much already said. I mean, in espionage terms, which is what the Russian hack SolarWinds appears to be thus far in terms of what we know, that is something where, the Five Eyes, including the UK, have actually a reasonably aggressive history. So they will not be, for good reason. Many would say, there's better decisions, reduced chance of escalation through ignorance and so forth. But it's not something where the foundations are there for. The trickier part, and I may be saying something slightly different to Nicole here, but the trickier part is, I think there's something about the imbalances in the digital societies of, say, the West and Russia on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. We have these highly integrated, highly networked, open, free societies. I mean, the whole internet economy and society grew up about free connectivity. That's what it's about. So funnily enough, it's not that secure. And these more authoritarian societies can inflict pain on that. And we find it really difficult to retaliate in kind. So like Nicole, I don't know and will never know probably about whether any apparent intrusions by the US into Russian electricity supplies and so forth acted as a deterrent. But my hunch, and it's only a hunch because I don't know, my hunch is it didn't. Because I don't think it's realistic to assume that the US would attack Russian civilians through its electricity thing. I just don't think it is. I mean, it wouldn't be lawful under most interpretations of US and international law. Certainly for a spying operation, it wouldn't be proportionate, even for electoral interference. If you had TV pictures of elderly hospital patients being denied care, would that be seen as proportionate because a bunch of Secretary Clinton's emails got leaked. So I do think there's this imbalance, which means we find it really, really hard, which leads me back to the point that actually I'm afraid to go back right where you started. There's something just about the security of our own systems, and that's about organizations. But it is an issue for companies like Microsoft, like SolarWinds, and a whole bunch of other people that none of us have ever heard of. I wonder if in 25 years' time, maybe even in 10 years' time, there will be a greater sort of legal and moral responsibility on those who provide key bits of tech infrastructure to secure them. There will just be an expectation. If you're going to be critical to the everyday flow of digital life, you're going to have to sharpen up security, because maybe it'll be regulated, or maybe it'll be incentivized by consumer behavior, or maybe both. I don't know, but I think that's an area that we're going to have to look at.
Thanks, Ciaran. Nicole, I just want to use the last section of today's call to touch on the PR journalist relationship, and particularly when there's a big hack, a well-publicized hack that breaks in your paper and other media outlets. Undoubtedly, you are inundated with calls and emails from people like myself, PRs, that are trying to get coverage for their clients, or if they work in-house, trying to get coverage for their organization. How best do you like to receive comments, and really what is the key to gaining cut through and trying to get coverage in the New York Times?
Well, I'm sorry to everyone. I know I have a reputation for not replying to PR emails, and it's because I get 2,000 a day. So, and it's just gotten worse. You said I've been doing this for 6 years. This is my 10th year at the New York Times. And I remember feeling so overwhelmed the first 2 years, just the jump in the amount of inbound I was getting at the New York Times compared to my previous job at Forbes was crazy. And before, I covered web startups and venture capital. So I thought I had it really bad then, because everyone was coming to me with their funding announcements and the new button they were adding to their software and whatever it was. So it's really hard. It's just a fire hose. It's every day. Please don't take it personally when I don't respond. It's just, if I responded to every email, I wouldn't be doing my job, because I serve my readers. So I have to budget my time accordingly. The messages that get through, it can be really hit or miss. It's usually, let's start with what doesn't work. What doesn't work is I write a story. The next day someone says, "Hello, Nicole, you may have read about a story about Chinese cyber attacks. Here is an expert. Like, I wrote the story, and I know that you're blasting every journalist on earth, but that's not going to go over well. You might as well just not send it. It's a little bit embarrassing. So make sure you're doing your homework, know who wrote the story. Think about, okay, they've already covered this element, so they're not going to cover it again with my clients as a mouthpiece. So think creatively about, what is the day 2 story, or what is the day 3 story, or, oh, do you have some data? Like, for instance, I mentioned, I think it was Palo Alto Networks, who had some really impressive data about the increase in the demand of ransomware extortion demands, and came to me, and the timing was a little bit off, because we're in the middle of SolarWinds here and the Chinese episode. So unfortunately, I had to kind of put it aside, but I definitely printed it out and kept it on my desk for the next ransomware story I have. So you don't always have to be tied to the news, but be thinking about, what is the day 2, day 5 story, or we are going to inevitably see another major ransomware attack. Why don't I get my researchers to start pulling that data from our clients on what they're seeing on their networks, how it's coming in, what the ransom demands are. But always, always, always be thinking about the reader, because if it's not interesting to the reader, then forget it. You might as well not send it at all. So those are my main things: is do your homework, think about the timing. If you can't nail the timing, at least start pulling together really interesting new data that's not just regurgitating what other cybersecurity firms have said. and then you'll have it ready for that big attack that is always going to come. That's really it. And also don't do the dirty tricks. There's just a lot of dirty tricks in this business. My biggest pet peeve is embargoes. I hate embargoes, but I get it. I get that that we all need to do it, but that's a big one. And trying to think of something else that you shouldn't do. Just don't take it personally if people don't respond, because at this point we could use another 100 cybersecurity journalists, and we only have so many. There's only really 25 maybe max, and we all get inundated. And there's so many new cybersecurity companies starting all the time, and we're outmanned and outgunned. So don't take it personally. And when the pandemic is over and we're all into the roaring 20s, make a point to introduce yourself to journalists at these conferences and make the personal connection. That's always really helpful.
Thanks, Nicole. That's really useful. Just touching on embargoes, I guess where they are used quite a bit is when companies invest a lot of time and money in big research projects, and they send these research findings to you. It's under embargo. How do you presumably you get lots of these research reports? How useful are they? And when someone puts an embargo on it, how do you like to be communicated to in terms of when you first receive the report to when the embargo is lifted?
Well, I think there's some really good uses for embargoes. For instance, Microsoft came to us the other day with the information about Hafnium, right? That was the name of the Chinese actor. And the fact that they were catching these attacks in the wild and rolling out the emergency patch. And of course, they would have an embargo on that. I think ultimately they ended up breaking it because someone was going to report it out on their own. So I totally get that there are legitimate reasons why there need to be embargoes for a lot of this. It's the unnecessary embargo that bothers us. It's like, okay, no one is sitting there with their finger on the button at 2 p.m. waiting to break your research about which industries ransomware is affecting. Like, that's useful for a story, but it's not breaking news. So you don't need to wrap an embargo around that, but I get it. I just think it's it's the same annoyance I have with government classification. Everything is classified now and it sort of starts to lose its meaning. Same with embargoes, I totally understand embargoing the really sensitive research and that there's business implications, but sometimes I just scratch my head and wonder, why is there an embargo on this? It doesn't really make sense, but I get that for planning purposes and coordination purposes across reporters, it's a necessary tool these days. So It's just it's annoying, but I get it.
Yeah. Okay, and just looking forward into 2021, clearly the last year has been fairly dominated by the pandemic. How do you see the cybersecurity landscape developing? And from a PR and communication point of view, what do you want to hear from cybersecurity companies about the next stage, what the new threats are, hopefully when we get back into the office or when there's this kind of hybrid working? How do you see the threat landscape changing at all?
Is that for me?
Yes, please, Nicole.
Okay. I think, well, I sort of already said this, but there are some companies. I'm based in Silicon Valley, so there's a lot of companies here who have announced that employees will have the permanent option to work from home. So how do you secure, sort of a permanent remote workforce? I think we had to figure that out rather quickly this year. And, how will that continue? I think is interesting. In my personal world, I'm sort of transitioning right now because my book just came out, and the book is really my, the summary of everything I've learned covering this over the last 10 years. And so I'm hoping to do more quirky stories. Like, I am working on a story right now about, I shouldn't even mention it because it's sensitive, but I am, I want to look at sort of like corporate espionage and I want to move into, I'm always fascinated by where surveillance is drifting, not just from governments, but from which industries are engaging in surveillance, and how to thwart that surveillance in the human rights world, but also wildlife trafficking and all sorts of things. So I'm hoping to come up with a story list in the next 2 weeks here, that really has nothing to do with what I've covered during the pandemic, because I need a change or I'm going to lose my mind. So, my answer is probably very different than most, but I do think the big story this year will be nation state attacks, how to respond. There's no getting around it, between SolarWinds and the Centrion, is that how you pronounce it in France? And the latest Chinese attack on Microsoft systems. There's just no getting around these attacks and how we're going to respond, or if we can respond, and what the deterrent strategy is.
Great. And just to finish off, Ciaran, over to you. What do you see as being the evolving threats over the next few months?
I don't think, as Nicole said, the traditional, if cybersecurity has been around long enough to have traditions, the traditional nation state attack seems to be making a resurgence. But I think that over the course of what she called the Roaring '20s, one theme that's likely to emerge, which is not going to lead to many dramatic events, but it's fundamentally important, is that there's a battle on, if you like, for technology supremacy between essentially the US and China, and that will define lots of things. It's different from the Russia problem because, in a sense, the tech that we all enjoy and use, sometimes get deeply annoyed by, but mostly that we've built our lives around, is built and operated by the American private sector. And even the worst Russian attacks have been, playing a game made and run in the United States, and where Nicole's sitting in California. Russia isn't building an alternative to that. It's just messing around on the one that exists. China is building an alternative to that. It's exporting it, and it's trying to build a better one, a more authoritarian one, but more economically powerful one. And so, security of cyberspace, as distinct from what we've thought about cybersecurity, which is about networks and, devices and all of that. Security of cyberspace becomes a lot more about who owns it, who runs it, how it's built, who controls the materials, how the surveillance systems work, what the model is, etc., etc. So it's going to be a lot more complicated, and more existentially challenging than it has been, in my view. I'll just throw that in at the end.
Thanks, Ciaran. All right, we are out of time. I think we've got through a few of the questions that were asked. So I'm just going to finish off by firstly thanking Ciaran and Nicole for joining us today. Another plug for Nicole's new book. Please go out and buy it. As I said, it's a great read. I'm about halfway through it now, but yeah, it's certainly a page turner. So I would highly recommend it. A recording of this webinar will be available on the Babel website in the coming week, as well as a written report. So we will send that to everyone who's joined the call. So yeah, again, thanks very much, Ciaran. Thanks, Nicole. And thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ciaran. Thank you, Simon. It was lovely to join you. And we didn't even talk about Harry and Meghan.
There's
the great UK-US divide now.
Yeah, it's covering the UK media, and yeah, probably best to leave that one alone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.